The wilderness is breathtaking, but it's also unforgiving. A peaceful moment can turn into a desperate fight for survival in the blink of an eye. From hikers and rangers to photographers and campers, these shocking encounters with bears will leave you gripping your seat. Some made it out alive, others weren't so lucky. There's no second chance when nature strikes. Are you prepared to face the wild? April 1st, 2024. Diana Larkin had spent years seeking adventure in the most remote and unforgiving landscapes she could find. An avid cyclist, passionate about endurance rides, she had traveled across continents, testing her stamina against the harshest conditions. When she heard of a secluded trail deep in the forests of Kamchatka, Russia, she knew she had to conquer it. The trail was winding through dense undergrowth and towering pines, the terrain that only the most experienced riders dared to traverse. It was a lonely stretch of wilderness, miles from the nearest village, with only the occasional sign of human presence. A hunter's spent shell casing, the remnants of an old campsite, reminders of how truly isolated this place was. But Diana didn't mind the solitude. She thrived on it. The morning was calm. She had seen no one for hours, the only sound being the rhythmic crunch of her tires over gravel and the whisper of the wind through the trees. She was so focused on the path ahead, on the grueling ascent, that she didn't notice that something was watching her. The Russian grizzly bear, a beast of raw power and immense hunger, had caught her scent long before she had even entered its territory. A dominant male, scarred from years of fights and hardened by the brutal struggle for survival, had been lurking nearby, scavenging along the riverbank. It had followed her for several minutes, drawn to the strange foreign scent of sweat and human presence. It was huge, over 1,300 pounds of muscle, bone, and fur, its claws long and razor-sharp, its mind ruled by hunger and primal instinct. Diana had no warning before the bear struck. One moment she was gripping the handlebars, focused on the trail ahead, and the next an explosion of force sent her crashing onto the ground, her bike skidding away into the undergrowth. She barely had time to understand what had happened before she felt the unbearable weight of the bear's paw slam into her back, pinning her down. A sharp pain tore through her body as its claws raked across her shoulder, ripping through her with terrifying ease. Panic surged through her as she struggled beneath its weight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear's hot breath was on her neck, the stench of rotting meat and damp fur filling her nostrils. She thrashed wildly, kicking out and clawing at the dirt. She was desperate to free herself, but could not escape the bear. Its jaws clamped down on her arm, crushing bone as if it were nothing, sending a white-hot agony searing through her body. She screamed in agony. The bear dragged her backward, pulling her into the brush. She twisted, trying to grab onto something, but the forest floor was slick with fallen leaves and damp soil. Her mind was a blur of terror and pain, her body failing her as the bear dragged her further from the trail, deeper into its domain. She felt its teeth sink into her thigh, the sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced. A horrific burning pressure, followed by the sickening realization that the bear was not just attacking her, it was eating her alive. She lashed out with her free arm, pounding against its face, her fingers digging into its coarse fur, but it was like fighting against a nightmare given form, an unstoppable force of nature. Blood poured from her wounds, soaking the ground beneath her, her vision blurred, her screams becoming weaker as her body began to fail. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot cracked through the air. The bear paused, its head jerking up, ears twitching. Another shot rang out, the sharp sound reverberating through the trees. For the first time, the grizzly hesitated, torn between its instinct to flee and its desperate hunger. Then, another noise, a voice, distant but approaching fast, a human. The bear released Diana's mangled leg, stepping back just enough for her to drag herself a few inches away. Her limbs were weak and unresponsive, but she forced herself to move. Another gunshot split the air, this time closer, and the bear decided to leave. Diana lay there, trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body racked with pain. Blood pooled around her, staining the dirt, her mind barely able to process what had just happened. She tried to move, to crawl, but every nerve in her body screamed in protest. A figure emerged from the trees, a hunter, rifle in hand, scanning the forest with wary eyes. He was older, his face weathered by years in the wild, his movements quick and efficient as he knelt beside her, assessing her wounds. His hands pressed against the worst of them, trying to slow the bleeding, his voice urgent, though she could barely understand the words. The last thing she remembered was the distant sound of a helicopter, the rhythmic thumping of its blades growing closer before the darkness took her. Diana survived, but the attack left her scarred in ways that went beyond the brutal injuries that nearly claimed her life. The wounds on her body healed, though they would forever bear the marks of that terrible day. But the fear lingered. The memory of the bear's breath on her skin, the unbearable weight of its body crushing her, the searing pain of its teeth tearing into her flesh, these things would never fade. She had spent her life chasing adventure, pushing the limits of what she thought she could endure, but she had never been closer to death than in those harrowing moments beneath the Russian grizzly's claws. And no matter how much time passed or how much distance she put between herself and that wilderness, she knew one thing with certainty: the bear had never truly left her. The Canadian Rockies stretched endlessly in every direction, a breathtaking expanse of rugged peaks, dense forests, and winding rivers that had drawn adventurers and families alike for generations. In the summer of 1994, Sarah and Mark Henderson had chosen this remote wilderness for their weekend camping trip, eager to escape the noise of city life and immerse themselves in nature with their two young children, 8-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Jason. The couple raised their children to appreciate the beauty of the wild, but they had never ventured this deep into the backcountry before. They had planned a simple, peaceful retreat, just a few days of hiking, fishing, and sleeping beneath the stars. The campsite they picked was located near a secluded trailhead. It was quiet, untouched, seemingly perfect. They spent the evening roasting marshmallows, the children laughing as they chased fireflies in the fading light, unaware that their presence had not gone unnoticed. Deep within the trees, a black bear stirred. It was large, powerful, and hungry, its instincts honed by the relentless struggle for survival. The summer had been unseasonably dry, food had grown scarce, and the scent of humans and their supplies had drawn it in. It had been foraging, following the wind, when the smell of their campfire and stored food became impossible to ignore. As night fell, the families settled into their tent. The world outside was dark and still. Then a faint scuffling sound disturbed the quiet of the night. The bear had arrived. It moved cautiously at first, its nose leading it toward the scent of food. A bag of supplies had been left near the edge of camp, and the bear wasted no time, tearing into it, rummaging through plastic and paper with eager hunger. The noise jolted Mark awake. At first he thought it was just the wind, but as his ears adjusted, he recognized the distinct sound of something shifting through their supplies. His heart pounded as he unzipped the tent and peered into the darkness. The dim glow of the moon revealed the hulking shape of the bear. His breath caught in his throat. Sarah stirred beside him, whispering a panicked question. But before he could respond, the bear turned its head toward them. Its eyes caught the light for a brief moment, gleaming with something primal and unpredictable. Mark's instincts screamed at him to act. He had always heard that black bears could be scared off if confronted aggressively. Without thinking, he grabbed the nearest object, a flashlight, and lunged out of the tent, shouting, waving his arms, doing anything he could to drive the animal away. The bear reacted instantly. Its ears flattened, lips curled back, and finally, it charged. The sheer force of the impact sent Mark crashing to the ground, the flashlight flying from his grip as the bear's weight bore down on him. His scream cut through the night. Sarah bolted upright, the children stirring in confusion before panic set in. The sight of the bear pinning Mark to the ground sent a surge of terror through her. She scrambled for anything, a rock, a stick, anything to help. But as she turned to move, the bear lifted its head, blood already dripping from its claws. In one terrible motion, it abandoned Mark and lunged for her. She tried to run, but the bear was too fast. It caught her before she made it 2 steps, its jaws snapping down on her arm, crushing bone in an instant. The pain was blinding, but the only thing worse was the moment when the bear forced her to the ground, its teeth sinking into her shoulder, its weight pressing her into the dirt. Jason and Emily screamed, their small voices shrill with terror, their minds unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before them. Their parents were being torn apart right in front of them, and they had no way to stop it. The instinct to run kicked in, but neither could move, frozen in place by the horror. Sarah fought with everything she had, her free hand pounding weakly against the bear's fur, her body thrashing beneath its crushing grip, but it was useless. The bear was too strong, too determined, too lost in the frenzy of the attack to stop. Her vision blurred, her strength fading, and the last thing she saw before darkness overtook her was Mark's unmoving body, sprawled in the dirt, his chest torn open. Jason finally found his voice, yanking his sister's arm so hard that she stumbled forward. With his voice breaking, Mark told the children to run. They turned and bolted into the forest, bare feet pounding against the cold earth, lungs burning with fear. The trees blurred around them, branches whipping at their faces, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. They ran until their legs ached, until their throats were raw, until their mother's screams had faded into a suffocating silence. The bear didn't follow them. It had what it wanted. They hid beneath a fallen tree, pressing themselves into the damp earth, their tiny bodies shaking violently, listening for any sign that the nightmare wasn't over. But the forest was deathly still now. Hours passed before the search team found them, their small forms huddled together, too afraid to move, too traumatized to speak. The rescuers tried to shield the children from what remained of their parents, but the truth was unavoidable. Mark and Sarah had died brutally, their bodies left where the bear had finally lost interest. The news spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. The Canadian Rockies, a place of beauty and adventure, had become a scene of unimaginable horror. Wildlife officials searched tirelessly for the bear, but no one could say whether it was caught or disappeared into the endless wilderness. The vast and untamed forest had taken what it wanted and offered no answers. Jason and Emily never spoke of that night in detail. They grew up carrying the weight of it, haunted by the memory of their parents' screams, the sight of their torn bodies, the feeling of helplessness as they ran for their lives. People would ask them if they feared the wilderness or hated the forest that had taken so much from them. However, fear and hatred were not the emotions that stayed with them the most. It was the silence, the terrible, endless silence of the forest after the screams had stopped. May 2nd, 2023. The Russian Far East stretched before them, an endless sea of dense forests, winding rivers, and towering peaks that felt untouched by time. The wilderness was beautiful and unforgiving, a place where nature still reigned, where predators moved silently beneath the canopy, unseen until it was too late. Alexei, Maria, and Dmitri had set out that morning full of excitement, eager to escape the dullness of their small town for an adventure they would never forget. They were 17, reckless and drawn to the thrill of the unknown, armed with little more than a few supplies and their smartphones. They had planned to hike through the forests near the Ussuri River, where the land felt endless and wild, a perfect backdrop for photos that would impress their friends. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. They had no real plan, no destination, just an urge to explore, to push deeper into the trees, away from the roads and trails. They laughed as they walked, stopping to take pictures of themselves, posing beside ancient trees, balancing on fallen logs, and capturing every moment as proof of their adventure. Then they saw it. A bear stood among the trees, its hulking form nearly blending into the shadows. It was a Russian grizzly, more than 3 meters tall when upright, a predator that could tear through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. The bear was foraging, its claws raking through the dirt, searching for roots or small prey. The moment felt unreal, like something out of a nature documentary, something they never thought they would see up close. Their fear should have sent them running. Every survival instinct should have screamed at them to back away slowly, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the bear before it noticed them. But fear was drowned out by excitement, the urge to capture the moment, to prove they had stood this close to a powerful creature. Maria pulled out her phone first, her face lit with a wide grin as she angled it for a selfie. Dmitri laughed, stepping forward, his hand outstretched to frame the shot. Alexei hesitated, a flicker of unease creeping into his chest, but the others were fearless, caught up in the rush, calling for him to join them. They didn't see the bear lift its head. It had noticed them now. For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. The bear broke the spell. Its speed was impossible. The ground shook beneath its weight as it crossed the distance between them in seconds, a blur of dark fur and raw power. Dmitri barely had time to react before the impact hit him like a sledgehammer. The bear's paw slammed into his chest, sending him flying backward. He crashed into the undergrowth with a sickening crunch, his phone spinning through the air before landing in the dirt. Screen shattered. Alexei and Maria turned and ran, their laughter replaced with screams, adrenaline surging through their veins. The trees blurred past as they sprinted, lungs burning, but the bear was faster, its heavy footfalls thundering behind them. It wasn't just chasing, it was hunting. Maria tripped, her foot snagged on an exposed root, and she went down hard, her scream cutting through the air. She tried to scramble to her feet, her hands clawing at the dirt, but the bear was already on her. It struck her before she could move, its claws ripping into her back. The force sent her sprawling, her face twisted in pain as blood soaked the ground beneath her. Alexei didn't look back. He ran mindlessly, his heart hammering against his ribs, every breath ragged. He could still hear Maria's cries, the terrible guttural roars of the bear as it tore into her, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't survive if he stopped. A sharp pain exploded in his leg. He fell forward, his body slamming into the forest floor, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. His hands clawed at the earth, desperate to push himself up, but the bear's weight crashed down on him before he could escape. The pain was instant, unbearable. Teeth sank into his shoulder, crushing down with sickening force, bones grinding beneath the pressure. His vision blurred, his screams breaking through the trees, but no one was there to hear them. He could feel the hot breath of the bear against his skin, the nauseating scent of blood filling the air. The claws came next, raking down his side, tearing flesh as easily as paper. Dmitri was still alive, barely. His body twisted where he had landed, his breath coming in short, weak gasps. He could see Maria's body lying still now, the forest floor dark with her blood, the bear standing over Alexei, tearing into him with relentless force. He wanted to move, run, and help, but his body refused to obey. His limbs were heavy, the pain overwhelming, his vision dimming. He closed his eyes. The bear wasn't finished. It moved with raw brutality, its powerful jaws clamping down on Alexei's arm, shaking him like a rag doll, crushing the bone before releasing him and striking again. Alexei could feel himself fading, his body slipping into shock, but the pain kept him tethered to consciousness. Then suddenly, the bear lifted its head. Distant sounds echoed through the trees. Footsteps, voices, the sharp crack of a gunshot. The bear hesitated, its ears twitching. Another shot rang out, not hitting it but close enough to startle it. It huffed, its breath heavy, its dark eyes scanning the trees before, finally, it turned and retreated into the forest, vanishing into the undergrowth as quickly as it had appeared. Rescuers arrived minutes later, too late to save Maria and Dmitri. Their bodies lay broken, torn apart by something far more powerful than them, their adventure ending in the worst way imaginable. Alexei was still alive, barely. His body was a mess of torn flesh and shattered bones, his breathing weak, his mind slipping in and out of consciousness as hands lifted him, voices shouting, trying to keep him awake. They rushed him to safety, to hospitals, to surgeons who worked tirelessly to keep him alive, to repair the damage the bear had left behind. He survived, but the visible and unseen scars would never fade. The world heard his story, the reckless pursuit of a perfect picture that had cost them everything, and the warning spread like wildfire. But even after the tragedy, some still wandered too close, chased the perfect shot, and believed the wild could be tamed until it reminded them otherwise. June 12, 1992. Emma had always loved animals. It was why she had devoted her life to caring for them, why she had spent years studying their behavior, and why, at 29, she had secured a position as a zookeeper at one of Austria's most well-known wildlife parks. She had worked with everything from lynxes to wolves, but the brown bears fascinated her most, their intelligence, power, and sheer presence. She respected them, but she never feared them. That morning, the park was quiet. Emma followed her routine, checking on the bears before their feeding. She carried a large bucket filled with food as she neared the enclosure. She knew these bears well, particularly the dominant male, Bruno, a thick-furred giant who had been at the park for years. He had always been calm around her, moving slowly, watching her with dark, knowing eyes as she worked. She entered the enclosure carefully, stepping through the reinforced gate and scanning the area to ensure everything was in place. The scent of meat and fruit filled the air from the feeding station, a mixture of food meant to mimic what the bears would forage in the wild. Bruno was nearby, his heavy form shifting as he stood on all fours, sniffing the air. He was used to her presence and his body language relaxed. Then a sudden sharp noise rang out somewhere beyond the trees. It was a loud clang of metal, as if something had been dropped against a railing, followed by the distant shout of a worker. The sound cut through the morning stillness like a gunshot. Bruno's head snapped up, his ears flicked, his muscles tensed, and in an instant, the calmness that had surrounded him vanished. His body went rigid, his breathing deepened, and he charged before Emma could react. The force of the impact knocked her off her feet. The world spun as her body slammed against the hard ground, air rushing from her lungs. Before she could move, a crushing weight pinned her down. Clawed paws pressed against her torso, their weight unbearable. She barely had time to register the pain before a searing agony tore through her leg. Bruno's claws ripped through the fabric of her pants, slicing deep into her flesh, hot blood soaking her clothes instantly. She struggled, trying to twist away, her instincts screaming at her to fight back. But the bear was relentless. Another swipe struck her ribs, tearing into her side, the pain so sharp it stole her breath. The world blurred, her pulse hammering as she tried to protect herself, her hands scrambling for anything to shield her from the onslaught. Her fingers found the metal bucket beside her. With the last of her strength, she shoved it between her body and the bear's face, just as his jaws snapped forward. Bruno's teeth sank into the metal, the sound of scraping enamel piercing the air. The bucket shook in her grip as he tried to wrench it away, his strength far beyond anything she could resist. but it was just enough to keep his fangs from sinking into her exposed skin. She screamed, her voice raw, desperate, echoing across the park. The bear's breath was hot against her hands, his growls vibrating through her chest, his claws still pressing into her bleeding body. Then, distant voices, distant at first, then closer, shouted. Footsteps pounding against the ground, a sudden loud bang, a wooden pole striking against metal, echoing through the enclosure. The bear hesitated, his body tensing as his focus wavered. Another sound, a sharp burst of compressed air. A tranquilizer dart buried itself into Bruno's side. He let out a deep, guttural growl, shaking his head violently, momentarily distracted. It was the opening Emma needed. Hands grabbed her, pulling her free from beneath the bear's weight. The sudden movement sent fresh pain tearing through her limbs, but she barely registered it over the flood of adrenaline surging through her system. The ground shifted beneath her as she was dragged back, away from the enraged bear, away from the death that had nearly claimed her. Bruno roared, snapping his jaws, his body swaying as the tranquilizer began to take effect. His movement slowed, his legs unsteady, his breathing deepening as the drugs dulled his senses. Within moments, his body sagged, his weight collapsing onto the ground. As he finally subdued, Emma's body trembled, her vision swimming as she gasped for breath. Her hands were slick with blood, her own. Pain radiated from her leg, her side, her arms, every part of her screaming in agony. Hands pressed against her wounds, voices surrounded her, urgent, panicked, calling for help. The world tilted as she was lifted, carried away from the enclosure, away from the predator that had nearly ended her life. The last thing she saw before darkness overtook her was the sight of Bruno lying still, his chest rising and falling with slow, drugged breaths. She woke to the sterile white walls of a hospital room, the beeping of monitors, and the dull ache that filled her entire body. Her leg was bandaged, her ribs wrapped tightly, bruises and scratches covering nearly every inch of her skin. The doctors told her she was lucky. Her injuries were severe but survivable. She wouldn't have made it a few inches deeper, a few seconds longer. The park launched an investigation, reviewing every protocol and safety measure to understand how it happened. The noise that had startled Bruno had been an accident. Nothing more than a worker dropping equipment near the enclosure, an unfortunate coincidence that had triggered a primal response in the predator. The news spread quickly. Some called it a tragic incident, others a failure in safety. But for Emma, it was a brutal reminder of a truth she had always known. Wild animals were never predictable, no matter how accustomed to human presence. Bruno hadn't attacked out of malice or rage. He had simply reacted, his instincts overriding years of captivity and familiarity. July 25, 2020. Lucas Harris adjusted the strap of his backpack as he and Clara Matthews pushed deeper into a national park in southeastern British Columbia. The two park rangers had spent years navigating the vast, rugged landscape, tracking wildlife movements and ensuring visitor safety. They were experienced and trained for the unpredictable dangers of the wilderness, but no amount of training could prepare them for what lay ahead. Their mission that day was routine, checking a trail camera set up deep in the forest to monitor bear activity along a remote hiking route. They had followed reports of increased grizzly sightings, particularly a sow with cubs known to frequent the area. The bears had been seen closer to the trails, prompting concerns about potential encounters with hikers. Lucas and Clara knew the risks, but carried the necessary precautions: bear spray, radios, and firearms, though they rarely needed to use them. The forest thickened around them as they reached the camera site. Lucas crouched by the tree where the camera was mounted, brushing a layer of damp leaves from its casing. Clara stood nearby, scanning the trees with sharp, watchful eyes. The stillness around them was familiar, almost comforting. Then a twig snapped. The sound was faint, nearly lost beneath the rustle of the wind, but it sent an immediate chill through Lucas. He turned, locking eyes with Clara. She had heard it too. A heavy, rhythmic movement followed, something large shifting through the underbrush. Then, from between the trees, a grizzly sow emerged. Her fur was dark and coarse. She was powerful and intimidating, with muscles rippling beneath her coat. But it was not just her size that froze them in place. It was what followed behind her. Two cubs, small and unsteady, trailed at her side. The mother bear paused, her dark eyes locking onto them, nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Lucas knew immediately what this meant. They had stumbled too close. A mother grizzly with cubs was one of the most dangerous encounters possible in the wild. Clara took a slow step back, her fingers moving toward the canister of bear spray at her hip, but it was too late. The bear released a deep, guttural huff, her ears flattening against her skull. Then she charged. Lucas barely had time to react before she crashed into him with the force of a truck, knocking him backward onto the forest floor. floor. The impact stole the breath from his lungs as her claws raked across his chest, shredding fabric and skin in one brutal swipe. Pain exploded through him as he struggled, his hands pushing against her body, but she was too strong. Her teeth snapped dangerously close to his throat, hot breath washing over his face as she roared in fury. Clara moved fast. She yanked the bear spray from her belt, pulled the safety tab, and aimed. A burst of orange mist shot from the nozzle, filling the air with its choking, burning potency. But the wind betrayed them. The cloud of chemical deterrent blew back, engulfing Clara and Lucas in a blinding haze. Lucas gasped, his throat seizing as the fiery mist filled his lungs. His eyes burned, watering uncontrollably as his body convulsed in pain. He heard Clara coughing violently beside him, her vision stolen by the backdraft of the spray. The bear recoiled for only a moment before shifting her focus. Clara had moved. She tried to stumble backward, disoriented by the burning in her eyes, but the grizzly was on her in an instant. The sow's claws sank into Clara's side, her weight crushing her to the ground. A sickening crunch echoed through the trees as the bear clamped her jaws onto Clara's arm, dragging her deeper into the undergrowth. Lucas forced himself to move, ignoring the agony pulsing through his shredded chest. He fumbled for his radio, but his hands were slick with blood, his fingers trembling as he fought to activate it. Static hissed through the receiver as he gasped for breath, his mind racing for any plan, but his body refused to cooperate. Every movement sent waves of agony through him, his torn flesh burning with every shallow inhale. Clara's raw and desperate screams pierced the air. Lucas turned his head, his vision swimming, just in time to see the bear disappear with her into the thicket. The tall brush trembled, and snapping branches and heavy breathing filled the air. Then, nothing. He forced himself onto his knees, his chest heaving as he crawled forward, every nerve in his body screaming in protest. He couldn't leave her. He wouldn't. Lucas staggered to his feet, gripping his knife with a shaking hand. He pushed through the dense foliage, branches slashing at his face as he followed the deep drag marks in the soil. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he forced his battered body forward. Then, through the dense brush, he saw her. Clara lay crumpled in the dirt, her body mangled, her skin torn in deep, vicious gashes. Her eyes fluttered, her breaths shallow, her blood seeping into the earth beneath her. The grizzly was gone, her rage spent, her maternal instinct satisfied that the threat had been neutralized. Lucas collapsed beside Clara, pressing his hands against her wounds in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. His radio crackled, distant voices shouting his name, but he could barely register the words. His blood pooled beneath him, his strength waning with each passing second. Clara's fingers twitched, barely brushing against his arm before falling still. By the time the rescue team arrived, she was gone. Lucas survived, barely. His wounds ran deep, both in flesh and spirit. The physical scars would heal, but the memories would never fade. He could still hear Clara's final breaths, feel the weight of her slipping away in his arms, and still see the menacing silhouette of the bear before it charged. Investigations followed, protocols were reviewed, and debates raged over whether rangers needed stricter guidelines for working in high-risk zones. The wilderness, they all knew, could never be tamed, but could they have done more? Lucas knew the answer. Nothing could have changed what happened that day. They had walked into the wild, and the wild had answered, and it had taken Clara with it. October 28, 2005. Rachel had always been drawn to the wild, the untamed beauty of nature calling to her in a way that nothing else had. As a wildlife photographer, she had spent years capturing images of the most elusive creatures, her camera a witness to the raw power and elegance of the animal kingdom. At 36, she had traveled to some of the most remote regions on Earth, but none fascinated her more than Kodiak Island. The Alaskan wilderness was home to some of the largest bears in the world, and Rachel had spent weeks preparing for this trip, researching their behaviors and mapping out the safest vantage points to observe them from a distance. On the third day of her expedition, she set out early, her backpack filled with equipment and supplies. The morning was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling the air as she hiked toward a creek she had scouted the day before. The sound of rushing water grew louder as she approached, her eyes scanning the banks for any sign of movement. She had seen fresh tracks nearby the previous evening, and she knew the bears frequented the area in search of salmon. With careful steps, she moved closer, her camera raised and ready. Rachel positioned herself near the creek's edge, adjusting her lens as she focused on a bald eagle perched on a fallen tree across the water. She was so absorbed in framing the perfect shot that she failed to notice the movement in the dense brush behind her. A low, rumbling growl shattered the morning stillness, and her entire body went rigid. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. Less than 30 feet away, a Kodiak bear stood on all fours, her fur bristling as she released another guttural warning. Rachel's heart pounded as she took in the scene. A pair of cubs nestled behind their mother, their small, curious faces peering at her from the undergrowth. Panic surged through her veins. She had made a fatal mistake. She was too close. The sow saw her as a threat. Before she could even think to move, the bear lunged. A blur of muscle and fur closed the distance in seconds, and Rachel barely had time to throw up her arms before the full weight of the bear slammed into her. The impact sent her sprawling onto the rocky ground, her camera shattering beside her. A fiery pain exploded across her shoulder as the bear's claws raked through her jacket and into her flesh, the force of the swipe so powerful that she felt her body lift off the ground before slamming down again. Rachel gasped, her vision swimming as the bear loomed over her, its breath hot and stinking of raw meat. Her instincts screamed at her to fight, to flee, but she knew any sudden movement would trigger a worse response. The bear's massive paw came down again, this time against her thigh, and she let out a strangled cry as she felt the sharp claws slice through muscle. Adrenaline surged through her, dulling the agony just enough for her to think. She had bear spray in her pocket, but reaching for it meant moving. Any movement could push the bear further into an attack. The bear pressed her down, its weight crushing the air from her lungs as it snarled. She could feel its saliva drip onto her face, the sheer size of its head making her feel impossibly small. She needed a chance, a distraction, anything. The bear lifted its head slightly, its attention shifting briefly, and Rachel seized the opportunity. With every ounce of strength she had left, she forced her hand into her pocket, fingers fumbling desperately until they wrapped around the cold metal of the canister. As the bear's head lowered again, she tore the spray free, aimed as best as possible, and pressed the trigger. A cloud of burning orange mist exploded into the bear's face. The reaction was instant. The sow roared in fury, rearing back as the chemical irritant took hold. It pawed at its eyes, shaking its head violently as it staggered away from Rachel. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. Every part of her body screamed in protest as she crawled backward, dragging herself over the rocks toward a cluster of boulders. Her vision blurred with pain and exhaustion, but she forced herself forward, her breathing ragged. Blood soaked through her torn clothing, warm and sticky against her skin. The world tilted, darkness creeping at the edges of her sight, but she fought to stay conscious. She had to escape, find higher ground, and make herself less vulnerable. She barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching, her mind too shocked to process what was happening. But then she heard a distant, unfamiliar voice shouting something she couldn't understand. A figure emerged from the trees, moving fast toward her. The bear, still blinded and confused, let out a final growl before turning and disappearing into the brush, its cubs following close behind. Strong hands grasped her arms, pulling her up just as her legs gave out. She was only vaguely aware of the pain. The stranger's voice spoke again, urgent and reassuring, but she couldn't focus on the words. The last thing she saw before her vision went black was the endless stretch of blue sky above her. When she woke, she was no longer in the wilderness. Sterile scent of antiseptic filled her nose, and the steady beep of machines was a distant hum in the background. Her body ached, and every inch of her was wrapped in bandages. She was alive. The realization sent a wave of relief and exhaustion crashing over her. Her recovery was long and grueling. The wounds on her back and legs required surgery, and the scars would remain forever. But the nightmares, the feeling of being trapped beneath that beast, haunted her in ways she never could have imagined. The wilderness, once her sanctuary, now carried the weight of terror. She knew she would return to it one day. She couldn't imagine a life without it, but she would never again underestimate the unpredictable force of nature. She would carry the scars forever, but they were a small price to pay for another chance at life.